A pleasant greetings to all. My name is Watson Joseph, a graduate architectural technology student from Leeds Beckett University, and this is my research paper on disaster management and urban resilience within the Caribbean. The research paper consists of an overview that will outline an introduction, definition of research, research process, research result, and finally a conclusion. With a global increase in climate change, natural disasters are becoming increasingly frequent in the Caribbean. The increased frequency and intensity can be directly attributed to climate change. However, climate change may also be the driving force behind fewer yet more powerful hurricanes and tropical storms. A recent report done by the Caribbean Disaster Management Agency, CDMA for short, states that within the recent decades, the region has experienced repeated losses from hurricane and associated wind, rain, and storm surge damages. According to the research mentioned above, the Caribbean is the second most hazard-prone region in the world. Regular annual disaster losses are estimated at 2.3 billion, with significant losses to social productive sector. This research paper aims to identify the reason behind structural failures during a natural disaster and the impact of disaster management and urban resilience within the planning department in the Caribbean. The definition of this research will be established by asking key questions such as why structures fail during a natural disaster? Is there any disaster management scheme in place in the Caribbean? How can urban resilience be strengthened post a natural disaster reconstruction? All these questions has been answered by data collection, which was done via qualitative approach with a conservative worldview. This qualitative research is a multi-method and focus involving an interpretive and naturalistic approach to the subject matter. The primary data collection method used was a questionnaire to understand the community view on this subject matter. Natural disasters are common problems to many Caribbean countries. With the frequent reoccurrence of natural disaster caused by this phenomenon, the region has faced numerous hurricanes which causes devastation to these islands' economy, infrastructure, and way of living. Therefore, it is imperative to understand why structures fail and how it can be mitigated to prevent such failures from reoccurring during this phenomenon. So the research question poses is that what can be done to mitigate these structural failures from happening? Based on some literature reviews, since 2009, the CDMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency, their mandate has expanded to strategically position the regional disaster management body. This should enable them to assume responsibility of being a facilitator, driver, coordinator, and motivated force for the promotion and engineering of comprehensive disaster management in all participant states, including the Turks and Caicos Islands, which this research paper will be solely focused on, with the primary responsibility for the coordinating of emergency response and relief efforts to any Caribbean states that may require such assistance when needed. Some of these functions are as follows: mobilizing and coordinating disaster relief, mitigating or eliminating as far as practicable the immediate consequences of a disaster, the adaptation of disaster loss reduction and mitigation policies and practices at the national and regional level, coordinating the establishment, enhancement, and maintenance of adequate disaster response capabilities. So the disaster process here, you can see from this picture, consists of four key aspects, which is preparation, response, recovery, and then mitigation. According to some literature review, in the Caribbean, we need to design in a way that it will be more resilient post natural disaster. And by doing so, a number of community with disaster management program in place has increased. Greater access to community disaster management products and the effectiveness of communities and the community level must be measured. Considering the continuous increase of cities and size, population diversity, and complexity, it can be observed that their vulnerability to future extreme event and disaster increase proportionally. According to the UN report, building resilience rests on three complementary building blocks of effective risk management: structural protection that aims to reduce disaster risks, mixed up to the first pillar, supported by investment in early warning system and resilient infrastructure, with appropriate land use and zoning rules and building codes and coordinated social safety nets. The second key element is to build financial resilience to mitigate the economic cost of disaster, including through risk transfer tools such as insurance. The pillars are complementary because building structural resilience takes time and risk cannot always be avoided or reduced, meaning that disaster risk financing must accompany these efforts. So how can we mitigate structural failures within the Caribbean? Mitigation is a type of long-term pre-disaster planning which involves sustained expenditure on structural and non-structural efforts to reduce or eliminate future risks. In the previous listed article, Dr. O'Connor stated that mitigation plans and activities are, in practice, usually medium to long term, and mitigation is also a cornerstone of emergency management since it is an example where thinking ahead pay off in the long run. Mitigation means to lessen the effect or takes action towards the building and putting together of certain structures and plan so that the impact of any future disaster will be ameliorated or eliminated if possible. A qualitative research survey was conducted and aimed at individuals and professionals within the Caribbean. The individuals chosen were a mixture of professionals within the built environment and community as well. Out of the responses received, 70% were from the built environment industry, whilst the remaining 30% were members of the public and business sector. For the Turks and Caicos Islands to be more urban resilient, and its post-natural disaster reconstruction, alternative means of building design are required, such as aerodynamic design homes, which in turn should account for structural robust construction fixing whilst constructing the building. In regards to post-natural disaster reconstruction, buildings should be inspected by a structural engineer before work can begin to prevent such failures from occurring again in the future. Depending on the damage done to the structures, it can be either retrofitted to suit amended building regulations or demolished to rebuild to standards in line with the current regulation in place. Adequate site inspections are needed when reconstructing post a natural disaster to avoid repeating previous mistakes. In this study, the discussion has been established that a large majority of the public thinks that the Caribbean does not have a good disaster management scheme in place. Some think that it does, whereas some have little to no knowledge of any scheme available in that area. These findings present a challenge to the mandate presented by the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, which has expanded to position the regional disaster management scheme to its member states mentioned earlier. Most information about disaster preparedness in case of emergency, disaster management plans, policies, and guidelines have been in existence and accessible. Therefore, the study reveals that information is there and require revision because 40% of the public believes that there is not a good disaster management scheme in place for the region. The study has revealed that urban resilience indeed can be strengthened after a natural disaster. Many of the public also believes that alternative ways of design and building needs to be taken into consideration to mitigate the impact of structural failures, some of which are hurricane-resistant homes and updating buildings codes to constructing in hazard-prone area. More government funding are needed to construct resilience home for the poorest in society, which will ameliorate the way the less fortunate lives and build. Amelioration means to change things for the better, and impact can be understood as the consequences or the likelihood of something happening in the first place if the latter is theoretically possible. As you can see from this slide, this shows a wind pattern of how homes are affected during a natural disaster. As you can see, this red area which shows greater wind pressure that applies on the wall, which makes it more susceptible for the building to collapse. Where you can see from this area as well that the wind actually flows over the top, which applies a lower pressure. And from this chart, you can see the hurricane resistant homes, which is designed using an aerodynamic approach. With this approach, you can see that when the wind hits the building, because the building is aerodynamic, it flows around the building rather than applying pressure on the wall, just like we've seen previously from the image shown before. But the wind will actually flows around the building, which brings less pressure to the buildings, and it will stand firmly after a natural disaster. In conclusion, as the research has demonstrated, disaster management and urban resilience within the Caribbean are ineffective, thus leaving thousands affected and homeless in the aftermath of a natural disaster, such as an hurricane. The intention is to identify the reason behind structural failures during a natural disaster and the impact of disaster management and adopting a resilient approach to the building design within the region. The economy influences the way structures are designed and built within the Caribbean. This brings a challenge to the construction industry in terms of building resilient structures which can withstand hurricane force winds. Moreover, the lack of building planning plays a role in structural failures during a natural disaster. The government should impose a fine on anyone caught building illegally without the proper guidance and recommendation from the local authorities. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been my research paper. Thank you very much, and I welcome any question from the panel.